looking from your side, it might be the extreme far right.
Thank you. Michael Ezra. My question is a bit of a follow-on from the previous question. You mentioned that Michael Milken was one of your heroes.
Yes.
And you also said that what he'd gone to prison for was being successful.
Yes.
I mean, he actually went to prison for securities fraud. And insiders dealing was suspected, but that's not in part of the plea bargain, didn't come up. So if we just look at the securities fraud that he actually went, in part he was fined, I think, $400 million for that bit alone, was ripping off basically investors with warrants by investing them with his
So, as I get the question, I disagree with all of that. It's not true that he was convicted of security fraud. Some of the stuff he was convicted of 5 accounts. I think 3 of them were tax related. 2 of them were kind of security fraud, but minor violations in which everybody in the past had gotten a slap on the wrist and a fine, and the judge said, I'm going to make an example of you and send you for 10 years in jail. But more than that, Michael Milken didn't go to court because the SEC basically told him that if he dragged this out, they would go after his brother, they would go after his father, they would drag his entire family into court. They were out to destroy him. The best book on Michael Milken ever written is a book called Paycheck by Diana Feischel, who is a professor of law at Chicago University. I encourage you. But nothing Michael Milken did was at the expense of shareholders, at the expense of people he had a fiduciary responsibility towards.
Okay, well, sorry, to come back on that point, that's what you're saying. According to the court, at a particular point in time, and what he actually pleaded to was on the $400 million
well, minor
fine.
security violations.
$600 million fine is hardly a minor violation. So someone that pleads and agrees to that is not exactly like a parking ticket. And in terms of that $400 million fine, what it actually was warrants that he'd given in part to his family members as opposed to the end investors. Now, according to that, and so my question basically
I think I'd like to
do you think that you should be able to rip off investors?
Out afterwards, but
I do not believe any of those counts were legitimate. I do not believe Michael Milken did anything wrong. I believe that he pleaded because so many businessmen in this room probably know that when the government comes after you with criminal prosecution, it's much easier to plead than to fight. And the cost to Michael Milken, it was easier for him to cut a deal than it was to fight it through. And I think it's one of the great tragedies of the late 20th century, the fact that Michael Milken didn't go to court, didn't stand up to them, and didn't prove the allegations false, and instead settled. But so many businesses, if by that standard, every one of the banks, that cuts a deal with the regulators is criminally, you already assume they're guilty. I always assume that they're innocent, and that these bastards at the government are going after them and using the guns that they have to force them into a plea, which is exactly what they do, right? Why did J.P. Morgan have more fines against it post-financial crisis than any other bank? When J.P. Morgan probably had no losses during the financial crisis, had a clean portfolio, did everything kind of right, was brilliantly managed, but it paid the biggest fines. The only reason is that J.P. Morgan was the only bank CEO other than John Allison to criticize Dodd-Frank and to personally criticize Barack Obama. And you don't do that. And if you do that, the regulators are coming after you. Why did one of the rating agencies get a huge fine and the other 2 not get big fines? Because it was the only rating agency that lowered the ratings for U.S. government bonds. But they acted exactly the same as the other rating agencies when it came to the mortgage crisis, but the regulators went after them as a vendetta for them daring to lower the government bonds, when the government bonds should have been lowered in the ratings. So I'm sorry, I don't trust the court system anymore. I don't trust prosecutors anymore. I certainly don't trust the attorney generals. I've seen personally what they do and how vindictive they are and how anti-justice and rule of law they are. So the fact that somebody settles, it's sad, but I don't assume that they're guilty at all.